On this episode of China Unscripted, Hong Kong is under siege. Is the Communist Party getting away with it? And why is the Pope silent on China? Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Gnesta.
Joining us today is Benedict Rogers, co-founder and chief executive of Hong Kong Watch. Benedict, great to have you back on again.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So I really like the severed head of Xi Jinping you have in the background there.
That's right. I was actually given it in Taiwan.
Really?
Yeah, and I've kept him there ever since.
Oh, that's my favorite province of China.
Yes.
So you're the chief executive of Hong Kong Watch. Being a chief executive, you must know what it's like for Chief Executive Carrie Lam. Do you think you have a sort of sympathy for all the responsibilities of being a chief executive?
Well, I only took up this post a couple of weeks ago. So although I've been very involved in Hong Kong Watch before that, but what I would say is that perhaps in contrast to other chief executives, I am nobody's puppet.
Ooh, is that a swipe at poor Miss Carrie Lam?
I guess it is, but I think she really deserves all the swipes we can give her with the way she's conducted herself in office over the last few years.
Oh, I'm gonna have to get my Carrie Lam Lego thing at some point during this podcast. But so I know you were actually banned from entering Hong Kong even before the national security law happened. So do you have any plans to go back now that the national security law is in effect?
Well, you're right, and it's actually very timely because it's on this coming Sunday, the 11th of October. It's the third anniversary of my denial of entry into Hong Kong. And it's extraordinary what's changed in Hong Kong in the 3 years since that happened. But no, sadly, I hope I will go back to Hong Kong one day, but definitely not until the national security law is repealed and Hong Kong is free. It would be, I don't think I would have got in even before the national security law since 3 years ago, but definitely now, I think the risks to me or to anyone who met me would be very high.
So basically what you're saying is we shouldn't try to go back either.
I think that's right. I mean, the problem with the national security law is that it's so vaguely written that, any one of us, I'm sure, would be in breach of many categories of it. And the fact is also it has this extraterritorial application. So actually, I've been in breach of the national security law many times a day, every day since it was introduced, just by sitting in this chair in London and talking about Hong Kong.
You're British?
You didn't guess.
Well, so because it is extraterritorial, it just seems to me that, this has become a red line for the Chinese Communist Party. I don't think they're going to back down from this. But obviously the international community can't let this stand. So kind of like an immovable object meeting an unstoppable force. Where is this going?
Well, I think it definitely marks the total end of Hong Kong's autonomy and basic freedoms and the rule of law. It's surely a turning point for the international community. The international community's response rhetorically has been quite strong. In terms of actions, the actions that the United States and the UK have taken are certainly very welcome, but I think there's a real need for others in the international community to step up and really for the whole free world to unite in outcry at what's happened to Hong Kong, not just because it's devastating for Hong Kong, but actually if the CCP is allowed to get away with what they've done, they won't stop there. We talked about Taiwan a few minutes ago. Taiwan will be next, and our own freedoms will be after that.
Wouldn't you say that they have essentially gotten away with it, though?
So far, yes, I think that is true. And that's why we need a much more robust international response so that, yes, they may get away with it, but we need to ensure that they pay the highest possible price. So that means targeted sanctions and other forms of pressure so that they may get away with it, but not without cost.
Well, so you mentioned the sanctions the U.S. government has put on many officials in Hong Kong, which might actually have an impact on the Chinese Communist Party because we actually did an episode about it, how it cuts off potentially Chinese banks from the U.S. dollar. Do you think there's anything more that can be done? And in particular, what more can the UK do?
Well, so we have the US sanctions, which are very welcome, but I think it would be even stronger if many other parts of the free world also introduce sanctions. So I think the UK, which now has Magnitsky-style sanctions legislation, should be looking very seriously at imposing either Magnitsky sanctions on Carrie Lam and some of the senior police officers responsible for police brutality and officials in Beijing who are responsible for destroying the Sino-British Joint Declaration and breaking their promises to Hong Kong. Or if there's a possibility that the current Magnitsky legislation, the criteria may or may not be able to be applied to Hong Kong, and that's debatable. But if that's the case, the British government should either amend the legislation or introduce a separate sanctions regime. But either way, I think the UK should introduce targeted sanctions, and then I think other countries, European countries, Canada, Australia, and if the free world really unites and coordinates these kind of measures, then I think that could have an impact.
What do you think's stopping that?
I think a lack of political will. I mean, I think that attitudes towards the CCP have shifted quite considerably just in this year alone, for a range of reasons, particularly because of the COVID-19 pandemic, what's happened to Hong Kong, what's happening to the Uyghurs. But still, opinion hasn't shifted enough, and there are still governments that weigh up China's economic influence and are putting that ahead of the need to stand up. That's what's stopping it at the moment.
Can you give us an idea of what that conversation is like in the UK government right now about China?
Yeah, I mean, the conversation in the UK has shifted very significantly. Right up until the start of this year, someone like me was really regarded by many people in government and parliament as a real nuisance, as somewhat sort of marginal, fringe voice that keeps talking about inconvenient things like human rights in China, when Britain was pursuing what they call the golden era of Sino-British relations. And really, since this year, I think because of the pandemic, Hong Kong, the Uyghurs, and also the debate around Huawei, and a realization among a significant number of parliamentarians that Huawei really was a threat in national security terms. Though for those reasons, all coming at the same time, the body of opinion in Parliament has definitely shifted. So many mainstream politicians in all the major parties and on all wings of the parties are saying the kind of things that I've been saying for some time. And I think that's having an impact on government itself. So several times we've heard the Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab saying very early on in the pandemic that it absolutely would not be business as usual with China. So the golden era has definitely gone. And the only question, the only thing that is still uncertain and still taking shape is how far gone is it? How far will the British government move? But things have shifted definitely from how they were just a year ago.
So the City of London is the world's most important financial hub next to maybe Wall Street. Where do they stand on UK-China relations now?
I think there are still very significant vested interests, and the body of opinion that still emphasizes business with China hasn't gone away. I think that what's shifted is the political discourse. But the City of London probably is a mixture. I mean, I think there will be those who will continue to promote relations with China despite everything that's happened. But there will also be many, I think, who will have looked at the undermining of Hong Kong's success as a financial center by the erosion of its freedoms and the rule of law. And they'll be looking at that with considerable alarm. So I think that a mixture of opinions in the city.
Well, just for clarity for people watching, because I didn't know this up until like a month or two ago, the City of London and London are two separate things, right? The City of London is a little more like what we in the U.S. call Wall Street.
That's exactly right, yes.
Well, yeah, it certainly seemed like the situation in the UK, at least the tone from the government, especially as far as Huawei goes, really changed after Boris Johnson got the coronavirus. I wonder if those are connected.
I think that it's entirely possible that his direct personal experience of the coronavirus, and bearing in mind, I mean, he came close to death at one point, may well have given him pause for thought about the reliability of the regime in the country where this virus started. And I think many people are waking up to the last governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patten, used the word mendacity, which is a word I like because it's a polite way of saying lying. But the mendacity of the Chinese regime in trying to cover up the virus in its earliest stages, repress the truth rather than repress the virus. And people are realizing that. And whether that's a factor in Boris Johnson's own thinking, I don't know. But certainly it is a factor in many people's thinking.
Well, it definitely seems amazing. Like, I can really relate to you saying that, you know, you've been trying to raise the alarm about the Chinese Communist Party for years, and, you know, people in power are like, yeah, whatever. And then suddenly everyone is like, oh, wait, hey, we should have been listening to this Mr. Rogers guy a bit more.
It only took a global pandemic.
Yeah, and Hong Kong and ethnic genocide in Xinjiang. It's like, it's finally they're realizing, like, oh, maybe this isn't a regime that can be trusted.
Absolutely. I think that's it's tragic that it took a global pandemic that has killed so many people and destroyed so many livelihoods to bring about that reawakening. But the pandemic, plus, as you say, the other issues that we mentioned, certainly has had that effect. And one of the effects it's had is that in British politics, you see key politicians in the governing Conservative Party from both the left and the right of the party speaking out on this, but also the opposition leadership of the Labour Party has really been highlighting the need for a complete rethink on China policy. So it's very bipartisan. And my impression is that's the same in the US. There may be varying degrees of differences between the parties, but on the whole, it's perhaps the only bipartisan issue on your side of the Atlantic as well.
Yeah, it's definitely true. It's been amazing to see how the Communist Party brings us all together at the end of the day. Now, you mentioned sort of an international response needs to happen. How do you think the rest of Europe is going? Because I know you guys had your little Brexit and aren't really part of that anymore. But what do you think the EU is doing, particularly Germany? Because I'm under the impression there's a lot of really strong opinions in Germany over how to deal with China.
Yeah, first of all, I should say we are still geographically part of Europe, even though we've left the institutions of the European Union.
You didn't build a wall?
We didn't build a wall, and we didn't sail off into the Atlantic. We're still in the same location, and I see the beginnings of a rethink among European member states as well. I think it's not as far advanced as it is in the UK and the US and Australia, but I think that there are some hopeful signs. For example, when the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi did a tour of various European countries, starting with Italy, France, the Netherlands, Norway, and ending up in Germany, I was a little bit involved in working together with Nathan Law, Hong Kong's most high-profile exiled activist. And Nathan got to certain capitals ahead of Wang Yi. So Nathan went to Rome a few hours before Wang Yi arrived there. He ended up in Berlin at the end of the visit to deliver a message to those governments. And we tried to do the same with the other European countries that he visited. And it ended up that all of those governments highlighted publicly in their press conferences their concerns about Hong Kong and about the Uyghurs. And the German foreign minister's remarks, I think, were particularly striking because Germany had been regarded as perhaps the hardest European country to mobilize on this because of their economic interests with China. And he came out in his press conference with Wang Yi standing next to him, calling for the repeal of the national security law in Hong Kong, calling for international access to Xinjiang to monitor what's happening to the Uyghurs, and really going much further than I expected him to do. So that shows, I think, that with a little bit of pressure from someone like Nathan Law, but also clearly there was rethinking already beginning. So we've still got a lot to do in Europe, but I'm hopeful that even in Europe there is at least the beginning of some awakening. We've also seen just recently the president of the European Union, in her speech to the European Parliament, delivering a very strong message on human rights in China, calling for the acceleration of plans to introduce Magnitsky legislation for the EU as a whole through the European Parliament. So these are all hopeful signs. Lots more to do, but some indications that the wind is changing.
Do you think that there is the possibility that the EU would put sanctions on Hong Kong officials?
I think we're quite a way off from that at this stage. I mean, what they've got to do first is get the sanctions legislation in place through the European Parliament. And I would imagine that if they were going to impose such sanctions, they'll be looking particularly at the situation of the Uyghurs in terms of the egregiousness of it. But I certainly hope through advocacy and through pressure that we may reach a point where we could see that. I don't think we're by any means there yet, and we've got to get the architecture of the sanctions legislation in place first, but we'll keep working on it.
Now, I know you mentioned Nathan Law, who is essentially exiled from Hong Kong. I know you're also in contact with other Hong Kong activists. Can you give us a sense of what their morale is like following the national security law?
Yes. So I'm in touch with quite a number of people who've left Hong Kong, and who I can speak a bit more openly about. And their morale is generally holding up very impressively. I mean, of course, it's tragic what has happened. It's tragic that they've had to flee their city, but they seem to have a remarkable courage and determination to use the freedom that they now have outside Hong Kong to keep campaigning and speaking. When the national security law was first introduced, I was very careful, and I still am very careful, but really for several weeks, I didn't contact anybody in Hong Kong because I wasn't sure what the implications would be for them. More recently, I've had some contact with some individuals who I won't name. The person I can name, because he's already very public anyway, is Jimmy Lai, who just seems to be completely devoted to this cause and willing to do anything for it and to speak out. So he has a talk show on his social media. I've appeared as a guest on it, a bit like I'm doing with you now. And he's his commitment remains strong. The others who I won't name, I mean, they're also holding up. I think many people are being more cautious, understandably, trying to be more creative, and of course, grieving for what has been lost in Hong Kong. But I think, despite those circumstances, their morale is holding up. Their determination to keep fighting it continues.
I wonder if it could kind of be like what happened after the umbrella movement ended in 2014, where everything kind of just went a little dormant or went underground for a period of time before, flaring back up in 2019. Do you think there's basically the sense that people will continue to fight, but just not as publicly?
Yes, definitely. I don't think people have given up. I think people will change their tactics. And the difference, of course, now compared to after the umbrella movement is the implications of the national security law are so much more serious. So people are no longer as willing to display certain slogans that are now banned, sing certain songs. They might, for example, hum the tune of a song rather than singing the lyrics of something like "Glory to Hong Kong." But they will find more creative ways. There was an example just last week, which at any other time would be just a normal everyday action, not even a form of protest. But in this case, it was a subtle form of protest of a high school student who sat on a MTR station with a copy of the Apple Daily and was just reading the newspaper. Now, for you and me, sitting on a train station platform reading a newspaper is hardly anything to comment on. But he was surrounded by police because they knew that it actually was a form of protest, even though what he was actually doing was not a criminal act. And I think you'll see more creative, subtle, but still sort of clear to anyone who understands the context, forms of protest.
And Apple Daily, that's Jimmy Lai's paper, very critical of the Chinese Communist Party, correct?
That's correct, which of course was raided after Jimmy Lai was arrested. Something like 200 police marched into the newsroom. And actually, another example of morale, I was asked by the Apple Daily about a week or so before the national security law was imposed and took effect. I was asked if I would be willing to write a weekly article for the English language section of their website. And I was quite surprised. We knew the national security law was coming, but I said, well, of course, if you want me to, I will. And when the newspaper was raided some weeks later, I contacted one of the editors that I liaise with to say, firstly, to check if she was okay, and then to say, if you want me to stop writing because of the situation, I'll understand. And the answer I got back was, not at all. This is business as usual. We're carrying on for as long as we can, and we definitely want your contributions. So that's an example of the courage and determination of the Apple Daily. Also, of course, we saw the Apple Daily shares rocket and sales soar when thousands of people lined the streets to buy copies of the Apple Daily after the newsroom was raided. So those are examples of, again, in normal circumstances, not particularly extraordinary acts, buying a newspaper, but in that context, signs of the determination of people to find ways to express themselves.
One thing I've been wondering is one of the reasons that the world paid so much attention to Hong Kong last year is because the protests were so visible. When you have 1 million people, 2 million people marching in the streets, that's pretty hard to ignore. But now that the movement has to kind of go underground or be more subtle about it, is there the danger that, the rest of the world, international media, they won't really be paying attention so much, and thus maybe the Chinese Communist Party can start to spin things their way? I mean, I'm thinking of an opinion article that was published in the New York Times last week by Regina Ip, who's on the Hong Kong Executive Committee, that said, like it or not, basically Hong Kong is part of China, and kind of pushing this line that, Hong Kong's more peaceful now, it's more stable now, the national security law was the right thing to do. Do you think there's the danger that, the world could kind of start to buy into that?
I think there's always that danger. And I think, therefore, it's up to people like me, groups like Hong Kong Watch, to keep the world informed and alert. So when things happen in Hong Kong that may not appear as eye-catching or dramatic as the protests, for example, if people who are not very high profile but who are arrested and who might not get the attention of the world, when that happens, we have a responsibility to try to mobilize the world. There's the case which has had some attention, but not probably enough, of the 12 young Hong Kongers who as a sign of how desperate their situation was, they got on a speedboat in the hope of trying to reach Taiwan, and they were arrested at sea by the Chinese authorities and are now in a jail in Shenzhen. And I think there is a danger if we don't keep the focus on them and other cases like theirs, that the world will move on. And so we just have to keep talking to the press, talking to governments, talking to politicians, and try to keep these issues on their radar.
How do you keep what's happening in Hong Kong fresh and interesting for your average person, so they stay interested?
Well, I think it's about telling the story of the fact that Hong Kong was, until very recently, one of the freest, most open cities in Asia, and has gone from that, not quite overnight, because it's been eroding for the last few years, but almost overnight, to essentially a totally CCP-controlled, directly controlled, repressed city, and making people realize that Hong Kong was really the front line in the fight for freedom, and that if that front line is, as it has been, taken by the CCP, the fight for freedom doesn't stop there. It ultimately will affect our freedoms. And so presenting it in that way, making people realize that this isn't just about the fate of 7 million Hong Kongers, it's about freedom itself, is really important. I have a role in that, but I think also prominent and even not so prominent Hong Kongers who've left Hong Kong now will develop a role in keeping that story alive as well, and using the platform they have outside Hong Kong to speak out.
I want to ask about the 12 Hong Kongers who are in a jail, are in prison in China right now, because it strikes me that their situation is especially dangerous, not just for themselves, but because since the extradition bill was what started this whole thing off last year, the idea that Hong Kongers could be taken to the mainland and tried in the mainland. And now we're seeing them being taken to the mainland. Like, if the Chinese Communist Party manages to successfully try these 12 Hong Kongers without any kind of pushback from, well, I mean, obviously there's not going to be pushback from the Hong Kong government, but from other governments around the world, then, do you think that this would be basically the thing that would allow them to do that more and more, like to slowly just bring more Hong Kongers to the mainland?
Yeah, I think there's definitely that danger, and of course the national security law as well does provide in certain cases for people to be tried under that law in the mainland. So in a way, having thought that we defeated the extradition bill last year when it was first, after a long time, suspended and then eventually withdrawn completely, it's now come back in an even worse and more dangerous form. So yeah, absolutely, it's essential not just for the well-being of the 12, but on this point of principle, that the international community should keep up the pressure for. And I think the argument is, because China will say, obviously, they were arrested according to China in Chinese waters. I think there's some question mark over that. And if it can be proven that they weren't arrested in Chinese waters, but in international waters or Hong Kong waters, then that strengthens the case. But even if that was the case, the argument is they deserve due process, they deserve legal representation, medical access to medical care, access to communication with their families, and they're not receiving any of those things in China. And certainly, as far as fair trial, due process, legal representation, we know from China's legal system that those things don't exist. So for those reasons, the international community should be urging China to return them to Hong Kong, where at the very least, if there are still charges to be pressed, which there will be, at the very least, they could have a somewhat fairer trial, somewhat more due process, and better conditions of detention at a minimum.
Well, is it actually illegal to leave Hong Kong without permission? Because I thought that, in theory, you should be able to leave a country, even if the border patrol wants to stop you from coming into the country. Like, what kind of country prevents you from leaving, except, of course, the authoritarian or communist regimes?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I suppose China's argument, as I say, if it is the case that they were going through Chinese waters, was that they entered mainland Chinese territory illegally. But then that's a somewhat odd argument if China at the same time says Hong Kong is an integral part of China. If Hong Kong's an integral part of China, then did they actually leave China? That's an interesting question for the Chinese.
I don't think the Communist Party considers any Chinese person anywhere in the world having truly left Chinese territory. Isn't that right, Shelley?
I am in China right now.
But now I'm just having flashbacks to last year when, Carrie Lam was like, the extradition bill, it's dead. We're not doing that. Why? Quit complaining. It's gone. It's not coming back. And here we are now.
Absolutely. It's almost like one of those scenes in a Alfred Hitchcock horror movie where you think the person is, you think the murderer is dead, and they jump up again unexpectedly. And it's as I said, I think it's come back in a new and even worse form.
I'm just wondering, what do you think is going to happen to Carrie Lam at the end of all of this?
What I certainly hope will not happen is that she'll be able to, as she stated her desire was some while ago, to sort of retire, possibly to the UK. I mean, I hope that the UK, at a minimum, even if it doesn't impose sanctions on her now, will certainly not allow her to retire quietly to Cambridge or wherever she might want to be. And I think she's gone so far down the path of becoming a fully fledged CCP stooge that really she has a choice when she leaves office. Either she's looked after by the CCP and enjoys all the luxuries and benefits of that might involve, or she renounces everything, but then of course she'll be in some danger from the CCP. So I think she's got herself into a really difficult hole. And if she'd actually, while in office, used her office to be the leader of Hong Kong rather than Beijing's representative in Hong Kong, she might have potentially had a little bit more respect from people around the world, and still not necessarily have faced grave danger herself. But now I think she's gone so far down the path that I'm not sure she can really go back. She'll just retire as a CCP leader, or of course, if she falls out with them because of the way she's mishandled things, maybe she'll face some retribution from them. But she seems to be doing their will now, and is just a puppet. So as a puppet, she'll retire to wherever puppets go. I'm trying to think of the right analogy for what you put a puppet on. But
Sesame Street?
That would be a good transformation. What character would she be on Sesame Street?
The one that lives in garbage?
Yeah, very good.
Well, but there is some hope for her, because what if the next chief executive of Hong Kong is even worse than Carrie Lam, and then we'll all just forget about Carrie Lam the way we forgot about how much everyone hated CY Leung?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I didn't actually expect that it would be possible to find worse than CY Leung, and in fact, when Carrie Lam was first appointed, I thought, well, she's got experience as a civil servant. She's I thought, sort of educated and intelligent. And I mean, she's been even worse than him. So as you say, I mean, maybe there'll be a fully fledged mainland CCP appointee to follow her. I have actually heard that rumor that they may just put in one of their own people directly.
I wouldn't be surprised. But, I notice as you talk about Carrie Lam, you're very polite. And, I have this impression that British people in general are pretty polite. So this is a bit of a tangent, but now I need to ask, British people being so polite, how did they respond when the news came out that the Chinese ambassador to the UK liked a foot fetish tweet?
I did not know where you were going to go with that, and that is not where I was expecting you to go.
You should know me better by now.
Well, I mean, I've never been obviously particularly friendly with Liu Xiaoming. In fact, I've never met him, and he's now blocked me on Twitter, as has the Chinese embassy. So, that's an advantage because I don't have to see what they get up to in their spare time.
Wow, so he blocked you on Twitter, but well, we know what he likes on Twitter, so like that's how he ranks you.
I mean, Chris,
Yes.
he was hacked.
Oh, right. It was a hack job, not
the
a foot
Chinese
job.
embassy called on Twitter to, investigate the hacking.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think this is now as good a point as any to transition to something else I want to talk about. So,
What a weird transition, but go ahead.
Everything works if it works. So we talked about how really, the international community needs to recognize what the Chinese Communist Party is. One country, institution, I'm not sure what to call it, that seems to be a bit behind the curve is the Vatican. Recently, they've renewed a very controversial agreement with the Chinese Communist Party to appoint Catholic bishops. The Pope has refused to meet Hong Kong Cardinal Zen, who's been very outspoken about the Chinese Communist Party. The Pope refused to meet with Mike Pompeo, U.S. Secretary of State, who's also been very critical of the Chinese Communist Party. The Pope hasn't even said anything about the national security law. So what do you think is going on with the Vatican?
Well, as you say, it is very striking that just as we talked earlier about the fact that in the US, the UK, even some European countries, Australia, and others, there is this rethinking going on, and to varying degrees. At the same time, the Vatican seems to have gone in precisely the opposite direction at a time when we're seeing the worst, what many would say is the most severe crackdown on human rights in general in China since the Tiananmen massacre, and probably the most severe crackdown on religion since the Cultural Revolution. I mean, when the Vatican-China agreement was first reached 2 years ago, and it was made as a provisional agreement for 2 years, I was critical of it at the time, but I at least was willing to give the Pope and the Vatican the benefit of the doubt. I didn't doubt that their motives were to better protect the freedoms of at least Catholics and ideally religious freedom more broadly. And so I thought, although I was skeptical that this agreement would in any way achieve that, I thought, well, let's see what happens in the 2 years that it's in place. My concern now with the renewal, or at least the likely renewal, I think technically it will be renewed shortly. I know the Vatican has told Beijing they want to renew it, and strangely, given that Beijing's got everything they want out of it, my understanding is Beijing hasn't yet responded. But let's assume it is renewed, which I think is a fair assumption. Firstly, the text of the agreement is still 2 years on a secret text. We know that it relates to the appointment of bishops, but the actual detail of the agreement remains a confidential text. Even Cardinal Zen, who is basically the only Chinese cardinal who's free to speak his mind, just about, has not seen the text. So if it's such a good deal, why can't we all know about it? Why is it secret?
Yeah, it's weird that the Vatican would keep secrets. I mean, unheard of.
well, that's true, but generally these kind of agreements shouldn't be secret unless there's really something to hide. So, but also it has clearly not achieved, assuming the goal behind it was to better protect Catholics. The situation for Catholics has worsened. No Catholic priest that was in jail before the agreement was reached has been released, to my knowledge, and quite a few have been arrested or disappeared since then. So it hasn't led to any improvement. We've seen not only what's happened in Hong Kong, but also what many would say may well be a genocide facing the Uyghurs. And this agreement seems to have brought the Pope's silence. We haven't heard him say anything, not even a prayer for Hong Kong, for Christians in China, for the Uyghurs, for any of these issues. So it's, I've written quite a lot about it, and I'm probably not the Vatican's. I've never been the CCP's favorite person, but I'm probably not the Vatican's either now. But it makes no sense to me. The CCP gets everything they want out of it in terms of control and dominance, and I don't see what the Vatican or the Catholic Church gains at all.
Yeah, that's what's really surprising to me about this. I mean, as you said, like there was that sort of 2-year period where it's like, okay, let's see what happens. But, we talked about the City of London. It's obvious why they are soft on China. It's about the money. For the Vatican, I could see if there was the argument that this deal will make the situation for Christians or Catholics inside China better, but it obviously isn't. I know in your recent thing, a recent article you wrote, you talked about some Catholics in Jiangxi who were imprisoned or detained. So it just doesn't make sense. What are they getting out of it? What possible benefit is there from this deal?
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, that's my question. I think what the Vatican or the Vatican's sort of defenders might argue is that the Vatican is playing a long game, and that they didn't expect to see results, very quickly or immediately, but they're in this for the long haul. But if that's the case, I mean, firstly, it's a very, very long game and at a very high price, the price of genocide of the Uyghurs and further repression of Catholics and other Christians, and at the price of seriously undermining the Pope's moral authority. The fact that every Sunday, pretty much, when he prays the Angelus in St. Peter's Square, he usually highlights some area of injustice or human rights around the world. And the one part of the world that has been conspicuous by its absence is China, and I think people are now really noticing that, and so his moral authority is being damaged. So implicit in your question is, I think the Vatican doesn't gain anything. Perhaps the only other argument that they might use is that if they withdrew from the deal now, the situation would worsen further. But I'm not sure how much worse things can get, and they probably will get worse anyway. And so why be a party to a worsening situation? That would be my response.
I guess it actually weirdly reminds me a little bit of the kind of economic deals that governments were making with China, in the sense that, when America granted China a permanent most favored nation status in 1999, when they got China into the WTO in 2000, the argument was kind of like, well, we need to work with them. If we just free them up a little bit, then, economically, then they'll be free politically. And there's still this kind of idea that, we can call China a competitor, but we don't want to call them an enemy. So if we just kind of try to find these kind of common areas with the Chinese Communist Party where we can work together on, we can have some kind of positive change. And that's the only thing I can think of, that like the Vatican is saying, well, it's better for us to be in China than to not be in China.
Yeah, I'm sure that would be another argument. But again, my response to that would be that shouldn't be at the cost of being silent on these major ethical and human rights concerns. I've never said that anyone shouldn't engage with China, that people shouldn't talk to the Chinese government. Of course, states and others should try to talk to them. And of course, the Vatican having a dialogue, having some kind of engagement is an entirely different matter. But having this agreement, formal agreement, that has brought about no benefits, that was a provisional agreement for 2 years and ought to therefore be reviewed, not just automatically renewed, seems to me crazy. And my message to the Vatican really is, at the very least, reveal the deal so that we can all know what's in it. If suddenly there's something amazingly brilliant in it that none of us anticipate, then we can think again. But reveal it, review it, and if it is as I've described it, then repeal it.
There's a separate issue with the Vatican, which is that they are one of the few states in the world that officially recognize Taiwan. Do you think there is a danger that the Chinese Communist Party could try to change that?
I'm sure, obviously, the Chinese Communist Party will try. This is perhaps the one area where all the assurances that I've heard suggest that the Vatican does not intend to go down that path, and I hope that is the case. When I've raised it with people close to the Vatican, but also when I've talked to the Taiwanese, they both insist that that isn't going to happen, and that this agreement relates to the sort of pastoral and religious side of the church's affairs in China, not the diplomatic relationships. Now, I mean, having said that, obviously, I didn't expect the Vatican to compromise as much as it has in the last couple of years. So I'm watching it cautiously and carefully. But the assurances I have had quite clearly are that isn't the plan, at least not anytime soon.
I'm curious what you think is at risk for the Pope if, as you say, he loses moral authority in the Catholic Church for being silent on China.
Well, I think the risk is, one of the motivations behind this agreement, I think, was both not only to protect Catholics in China, which it's failed to do, but also to bring about greater unity for Catholics in China between those who've been loyal to Rome and been in the underground church and those who have been in the state-approved church and been out of communion with Rome, and then those also who are sort of in between, who've secretly been in communion with Rome but have stayed in the state-approved institutions. But the result is certainly not what the Vatican intended. I think the disunity, both among those different parts of the church in China and then more broadly worldwide, has increased. And I'm not a natural critic of this particular Pope. I actually really like this Pope in general terms. I became a Catholic 7 years ago in Burma, about a week after he became Pope. And on many other issues, I like his message. I like his style. So I'm not an anti-Francis person by any means. But I obviously
You're
I'm
not
very
a Lutheran.
I'm not a Lutheran, no. But the same is true of I know a number of other people who are actually allies of Francis, but who are bewildered and perplexed by his position on China. So what I hope won't happen is that this issue be used by those factions in the church who are against him on everything else. It shouldn't be. This should be addressed as an issue in and of itself. And I think we're starting to see that. But if he doesn't at some point do something to speak out, to take a stand, to recover his moral authority, then I think more and more discontent will grow.
I know according to Catholic doctrine, the Pope is infallible, correct? But then how does that jive with something like not criticizing China? Is it a different issue, or I'm just curious about that particular Catholic doctrine?
So, as I understand it, and I think this is a quite widely misunderstood doctrine. When I was first exploring becoming a Catholic, I asked this very question, and it was explained to me that he's not infallible on everything. His infallibility is limited to the areas of faith and morals. So, in other words, the Church's core theological teachings. So if he were to, because I asked the question, if a particular Pope were to go mad and declare that, the weather was sunny when actually it was snowing, or, do we then accept his word for it? And I was told, no, of course not. It's only limited to those sort of core theological areas, which means that I think people like me are totally free to express our view of this agreement on China, because the agreement on China is not doesn't fall into his area of infallibility.
It's not church doctrine.
It's not church doctrine. No, it's a administrative arrangement that has been reached with China, which I think is profoundly wrong. But it's certainly not in any way church doctrine.
Well, that makes sense because we've interviewed Cardinal Zen on the show, and he's incredibly devout, very respectful of the Vatican, but is also a vocal critic of the deal with the Chinese Communist Party, who's been warning that the Chinese Communist Party is a threat for a long time. So that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today. Once again, Hong Kong Watch, where can people go to stay abreast of that or anything else you're working on?
Well, thank you. So Hong Kong Watch, we have a website, which is hongkongwatch.org. And we're also on Twitter and Facebook. And I personally am also quite active on Twitter and Facebook as well. So people can come to our website, to our social media, to my own social media, and we'd love to hear from you.
Fantastic. We'll provide all those links. Thanks again for joining us. Hopefully, someday we can meet in Hong Kong.
Absolutely, or even at least in person somewhere, which currently, due to the pandemic that the CCP has given us, we're not even able to do that. So
baby steps.
Baby steps. This was nice.
Yeah, absolutely.
This Skype interview was nice. All right.
Absolutely.
Well, it is great to see you again. Thanks, Benedict.
Great to see you. Thanks for having me.
Well, yeah, I really wonder what's going to happen with the Vatican deal at the end of the day, and with Carrie Lam, and with how the world reacts to the Chinese Communist Party. There's a lot of things I wonder.
I mean, there's a lot of unknowns, but it's interesting how, because you mentioned Boris Johnson had kind of changed his tune after getting the coronavirus. I wonder if people in the Vatican get sick, I wonder if they'll start to change their tune. I mean, obviously, you don't wish for that. Or there could be other types of things that just kind of make people reevaluate whether the deal is really working.
Shelley?
I'm just laughing because I was like, are you suggesting coronavirus as a foreign policy tool?
No, of course not. I'm just giving an example of certain incidents can radically and very quickly change people's perspective.
Yeah, that's true. The black swan event kind of deal. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that when Benedict was talking about, the long game, playing the long game, the Vatican might be playing the long game with China. I think China is playing the long game with the Vatican too, in terms of the Taiwan thing. They're not going to do anything about it right now, but maybe eventually,
I feel like the CCP plays the longer game. I mean, the Vatican has been around since ancient times, but
the CCP has been around 90 years.
It's been around since ancient times.
Yeah, but they are good at the Chinese Communist Party. That is very, very good at thinking decades ahead in a way that few governments are, or in few organizations are.
I don't know if that's true. I feel like that's kind of I think that's kind of a myth. I mean, I think they do think long term, but there is a myth about Chinese
collective unity.
No,
all working for
there are these meritocracy of technocrats who look at the long term, not like us fickle Western democracies that are always caught up in politics and stuff. That's the whole kind of that's why they're able to build these. It kind of feeds into that myth.
Yeah, I guess if they really were capable of thinking in the long term, they wouldn't have destroyed their environment. They would have a system where corruption is not destroying everything. They wouldn't have shadow banking. They wouldn't have debt crisis, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, all these things that kind of it's like they don't have they have a lot of problems, but we kind of build this idea around that.
I think what I'm referring to is not are they good at long-term economic or environmental planning, because they are not, but their influence operations, right, are they don't have to have a specific goal in mind for 10, 20 years down the line, but they know that if they start their influence operations now and they start elite capture now, then 5, 10, 20 years down the line, whatever it is that they need to get, they will have this mechanism that they've created. So they don't actually have to have a specific plan. They just have this general
idea that it's good to invest early.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Well, when your starting point is we are at war with everyone, then you kind of all right, let's prepare for this.
And there's nobody too small in a certain sense. They will go after the city councilors or,
sure.
You never know where they're going to end up. That's true, definitely.
Yeah.
But I think, in terms of the long game, in terms of the Taiwan and Hong Kong, I guess I feel more hopeful about Hong Kong than I did post 2014, definitely.
How? What do you mean?
Well, I think like a lot of people were feeling. No, I mean the situation's definitely worse,
Mhm.
but
Right.
I think a lot of people were feeling after 24. Remember what it was like when we went there in 2016?
Oh, like the defeated.
Yeah, like everybody was like the democracy like thing, it's over. Like
Yeah, just sort of like this quiet march to authoritarianism.
yeah. Whereas now I think that even when the kind of movement is driven underground, it becomes more of like the resistance in Europe during World War II, or it
Some
becomes
guy reading Apple Daily at the
yeah,
subway.
or like it becomes more like what happened in Poland or like Eastern European countries when like communism was starting to fall.
Where the movement is still very energized, even if it's underground.
Yeah.
It's interesting how things can be objectively worse in every way politically, and yet
People
you feel that things are better because the spirit is there.
Yeah. People can still hope. Yeah.
Yeah. And, the Communist Party's only way to really handle it is to crush people's spirit, and they're not going to be able to do it. And what they don't understand is that that spirit is actually contagious. And so the danger for the Communist Party is that that spirit will start spreading to mainland China, and it's going to be uncrushable.
Well, the other thing that's also contagious is the coronavirus, which has spread across the world and also changed people's spirits.
Interesting parallel. I
Yeah.
mean,
Which will win, the infectious disease from China or the infectious disease of democracy?
I bet they've
from-
called democracy
A thought virus?
Yeah. I'm sure
Yeah, they
something
have.
like that. Yeah. But interestingly, the whole idea about the spirit thing is kind of also a long-term thing where like after 89 they were like, okay, we can't let this happen again. Let's start with the national patriotic education stuff.
Right.
And so it took 20 years, but it worked for them after the Cultural Revolution too, in a sense. Remember when we interviewed Fang Zhen?
Mm-hmm.
If you haven't seen our interview with Fang Zhen, he was a Tiananmen Square student protester who his legs were run over by a tank.
He was an athlete.
He was an
prior
athlete before
and after.
and then he became like a para-Olympic type of athlete. And he was talking about how basically he felt the Communist Party was able to keep power by effectively controlling the memory of people. So he talked about when they were, young Tiananmen Square student demonstrators, they believed that there was like leadership that was corrupt, but they believed in the party because they didn't really understand what had happened during the Cultural Revolution. And he talks about, one of the reasons he wanted to keep the memory of the Tiananmen Square protest alive and talk to young Chinese people about it today is that he felt like now the younger people don't know what happened in 1989. So that's how the Communist Party is able to keep power.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of a global issue. People don't understand what communism is, and people think something different will happen.
I mean, nobody can know what it is because it's never been tried.
Well, that is the problem. It's never been tried. And it needs to, once and for all. And with that, thanks for watching this episode of China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Chong.
And I'm Matt Ganezda.
I'll talk to you next time.
And now I just realized what you meant by tried. Like
Oh my
put on
gosh.
trial.
Oh my gosh.
Okay.
Close.